Welcome guys to today's session, getting started with PCF Custom Controls. In this session, we will be looking into what is Power Apps Component Framework and how to develop a better UI using this framework. Later, we will also do a walkthrough of the process, and the idea is to create a custom control at the end of the session. Okay. So what is PCF and code components? So Power Apps Component Framework is gives pro developers an ability to create a reusable component, and that can be used on model-driven app as well as Canvas apps. And now, because we are creating a reusable component, now the citizen developers or the app makers have the ability to use this code components and use them on Canvas app, on model-driven app, on multiple forms or multiple projects. So we are creating reusable components for app makers to use it on multiple forms. That's the idea, right? So framework is allowing us to create those code components. Now, what is a code component? Code components are one of the type of solution component that is available on the solution. So whenever you're creating a solution in CRM or CDS, then you can add entities, you can add web resources, you can add security roles, right? So those are kind of components, and code components are another type of solution component. We call it as custom controls. Now, there are some advantages of using this framework. Now, what are those advantages? Whenever you're using this framework to create code components, then the output that is generated, the code component output that is generated is always optimized for performance. So you don't have to do anything fancy to optimize it for performance. Then your framework exposes capabilities to access contextual data or metadata. And then you can also use Web API out of the box as part of the framework. Your users get enhanced rich experience of UX rich experience. So you can build controls which you can see on the screen right now. Those are the type of controls that you can create. It looks really great, and everything is out of the box using the framework. Now, how is it different from a web resources? Now, if you have been building HTML web resources in CDS, and now code components are new things to you, then you would see how is it different, right? So I've not mentioned all the main differences, all the differences, but I've mentioned here the top differences that are available. So first thing is rendering. Now, when you're using HTML web resources, they are when they are rendered, you do not have access to the context. And normally you use some hacky solution to get the CDS context or CRM context, right? But then that's not the case with the code components. The code components, the context is part of the code components. So developers get access to the context and the metadata and the and the web API. Now, when the code components load, I'm going to mute everyone else. There you go. All right. So when you use the code component, the load time also plays an important role. When the component loads or when the form loads, the HTML web resources are the last one to load on the form, which doesn't give a nice experience for the users when the form is loading, because your HTML web resources are loading after all the other code components are loading. This not only decreases the load, increases the load time, but it also doesn't give a nice UI experience for the users. That is not the case with code components. Code components loads along with all the other components on the form. So like if you have a timeline control, or you have a subgrid, or if you have attributes, right? So all those components, when they're loading, this custom component loads along with those components. So it decreases your load time and also gives a nice UX experience for the users. Now, because we are talking about UX experience, your code components are also responsive. Now, the entire unified interface is responsive. So if you're looking your form on a smaller screen, then all the controls decreases in size. When you're looking your form on a bigger screen, then all the controls expand on the form. So it's responsive to your screen size. Now, code components also behave similarly. So they are responsive to your screen size. That's not the case with HTML web resources. For HTML web resources, you have to do some extra coding to make them responsive to the screen sizes. So that's all about rendering. Now, when we talk about number of files that we have to handle when we are using HTML web resources, if you're dealing with a complex HTML, or even if it's a simple HTML, you would still end up having one JavaScript file associated to an HTML and then one CSS file. So there would be minimum 3 files that you would be creating. And then you have to take care of deploying those 3 files in each and every instances, and then maintaining the source code and everything, right? Uh, Whereas if you're working with the framework, there's a project, and then project can have multiple files. It can have 5 files, 6 files, CSS, your TypeScripts, all those files, even HTML, all those files. When you build it, there's only one output generated. So it becomes easier for you to deploy or maintain those that custom control, right? So it's really beneficial in terms of deployment, or even when you have to ship it via app source. Now, we also talked about reusability in the previous screen. So I'm again going to mention it here because it's really that's the really real key when we are dealing with code components. If you're working with HTML web resources, there is no way you can make, even if you make them reusable, there's no way you can make them configurable. Like you cannot add configuration to your HTML web resources, and then it cannot differ on each and every form. Whereas with the code component, the way Microsoft has designed it, they have given an interface where you can go and configure your controls, and based on the configuration, your controls can behave differently on different forms or different projects. So that's a nice way, and that's what makes it reusable, because now you can create code components and then even ship it via an app source. So now how do you prepare your machine, and then how do you get started building these code components? So you would need 4 prerequisites. First is you would need either npm or node.js. Now you'd need either one of them, and then if you install npm, you would get node.js and vice versa. So you need to just search for npm or just search for node.js and then just install one of that. Then the second thing is you would need .NET Framework, and the version is 4.6.2 is what you would need. Now, if you already have Visual Studio 2017 or 2019 installed, then you would get, you might already have 4.6.2 installed on your machine. And if you even don't have that, then you can go to Visual Studio installer and then look for .NET Framework, and then you can see the versions, whichever versions is installed, you can just go and install 4.6.2 if it is not already installed. And the third thing is you would need some kind of IDE to write your code. So you can either use Visual Studio 2017 or 2019. Now, if you don't have license for 2017 or 2019, then you can always use Visual Studio Code, and it's a free version. So you can always use Visual Studio Code. You don't need any special license to use that. And the last thing that you would need is Power Apps CLI. Now, this is a command line interface that empowers the developers to create the code components. It gives you access to the framework. Now, how do you do your development? What's the development process? Now, as you have, you might have built some code using C# or Java. It's the same process. You write your code, then you build it, test it, and then deploy it. The thing that differs is how you create the project, how you build it, and how you test it. So first thing that you would need is you need to initialize your PCF project. Now, PCF project is a type of project that enables you to add components or add your code, like your TypeScript, your HTML, your CSS. All those things are what you would be adding in the PCF project. So it's kind of, if you think it's kind of a Visual Studio project where you can create a class library and then start adding .cs files. So similarly, you can create this PCF project and start adding your code files in it. So to create a PCF project, you have to run a PCF CLI command that would initialize the PCF project. Then next thing you would do is you would start adding your UI logic and your business logic to your code component files. Once you have completed your coding piece, then what you would need is to build your code component. To build your code component, you would need to run another command using PCF CLI that would build your code component. It would also go through the code check process. It would see if there are any errors or not, and then do all the build logic. Now, once your build is successful, then you can test your code. Now, to test your code, the framework gives you a test harness. So you don't have to do any special testing. You can use the test harness that is provided by the framework to test your code. For testing, again, you have to write some commands to run your test. Now, once you have tested your code and it's ready to go, then you can start your deployment process. Now, to deploy, first you would need is to create a second type of project called CDS project. Now, CDS project is a special type of project that we use for deployment. So you need to initialize CDS project and then add your component that you created using PCF project into the CDS project. So you add that reference. Now, once the reference is added, then you would build the CDS project that would create a zip file that can be deployed to your CDS environment. So now we have some community tools available. There are more than 200 code components that have been developed by PCF champions, and those are all amazing code components available for you. You can check it out by going to pcf.gallery. It's kind of a one-stop shop for all the community built code components. You can even share your ideas on it. So if you have some idea that it's very complex, you can either share it on PCF Gallery, and then the community always keeps on looking on this idea board, and then maybe even implement those if they think it's worth it. Second thing is, if you are not comfortable with using the command line interfaces, and if you want to even increase your build process, then I've built a PCF builder. What it does is it consolidates various commands into one button click. So you don't have to type in multiple commands to go through the process. So it increases your, it decreases your build time. And also you don't have to worry about the commands. The idea was that you don't have to worry about the commands so that you can focus on writing the code. And even deploying is available from the tool itself. So we're going to look at PCF Builder today in the demo. So let's go and look at the demo. So what I have built here is I've built a simple code component that counts the number of characters. So this is the code component that I have built, and it loads with this text, and then it counted how many characters it has, and then deducted it from 2000. So 2000 is what is we will be configuring it in the control. So we would be saying how much would be the maximum number of characters that this particular control can accept. And then we would be just counting down the number of characters remaining. So in case if I'm typing something here, then you would see that the number of characters would reduce. Okay, so now if you see, then the number of characters got reduced from 195 to 152. And then also, as I was typing, you would see that there are some unsafe changes been populated over here, which says that this control was changed. So now there are some unsafe changes. So now you can go ahead and hit save. So this goes and saves the record from the control into the source. So for example, like I entered this. Now this is a control. Control has its own data. The control needs to send the data back to its source, whether it be model-driven app, form, or whether it be a Canvas app. The control needs to send the data back to its source. So that is what is happening here. So this is what we are gonna try to develop today using the code. So let's try to do that. I'm gonna use my PCF builder tool. And if you don't have the tool today, then what you could do is I'm gonna use XRM Toolbox. So you can go and search for XRM Toolbox. And then if you don't have it on your machine, you can always download it. Once you have downloaded it, you have to go to configuration and then tool library. And then you get all these kind of tools. So you just go here and then search for PCF, select it, and then install it. Once it's installed, then you can search for PCF in the filter and then open it. Okay, so now I'm connected to my instance. So first thing you would need to do is you need to put your control location. So what I've done here is I've created an empty folder. I've just done node modules because I didn't want it to take time loading the node modules. So I've already copy pasted here my node modules that I would need. But basically what you would do is you would just create an empty folder, copy the path, and paste it in the control location. Next thing you would need is Visual Studio command prompt location. So once you click here, let's browse to the command prompt location. And in here, when you go to program files, you can go to Visual Studio. And if you have 2017 or 2019, you can go into any one of it. And based on the type of 2017 or 2019 Visual Studio you have installed, you would see Enterprise or Community Edition or whatever you have installed. You can go into that. And then in Common 7, you have Tools folder. So you have to go into Tools folder. And I've already pre-populated the file name that you're looking for. That is called vsdev command. So you just have to go and select this and then say open. So that's done. So we have selected the control location and then we have selected the command prompt location. So now you go and say new from blank. Okay, that initiates the command prompt and that initiates for us to type in the component details. So component details is nothing but creating the PCF project. So here I'm going to type in my namespace and the control name. And then the template. So now we have two types of templates. We can create a field type of template and dataset. Field type of template applies to one single attribute in CDS. And if it is a dataset, that means we are applying that control to either a view or a subgrid. For today's demo, we are going to go with the field type of template. And once we have selected these three things, we would go and create it. Now what it would do is it would initialize the project, and as you can see, the empty folder that we had got initialized with this files. So what you have is here you have the PCF project file and then some package.json and tsconfig file. Okay, so there are multiple files and it also has the node module. So node module got installed over here. So with one single button click, we initialize the project and also install the node modules that we wanted. So now second thing is now we have initialized the project. So what we would do is we would start writing our code. So to write the code, we are going to use Visual Studio Code today. So I'm going to open it in Visual Studio Code. So here what we have is we have two files generated by the framework. One is the control manifest file, and the other one is the index.ts file. So control.manifest file is nothing but it contains all the manifest data, like what would be the properties that would be involved in the control, where is the code files or CSS files or all your resources files are been mentioned over here. And then what usages are you going to use? Are you going to use a pick file or get current position or web API? So if you're going to use any of the web API, then you have to enable this feature. If you're going to use the position like latitude and longitude, then you have to enable this get current position. If you're going to use the audio, then you have to enable device.capture audio. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to change the property. And then here is the control data as well. So you have namespace. You don't have to change that because when we initialize the project, we have already mentioned what the namespace would be. You don't have to change the constructor. What you could change is the display name and the description. So you can give a name, you can give a space in between this display name and description, and then you can change it. So I'm not that creative today, so I'm gonna just put a space in between them. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the property. So we're gonna add property called attribute data. So what this attribute data is gonna do is, I can't spell today. So what this attribute data does is, when we looked at the demo, so let me go back to the demo. So this is going to be our text box, and this is going to be our label. But what I want is I want to capture this data, whatever data is already populated. I want to capture that data in one of the properties. So I'm going to bind my one of the property to this text box, and then this is going to be my label. So that is what the idea is going to be on my control. So this property is going to be my text box property. So I'm going to call it as attribute data. And I'm going to copy paste here again with a space. So property name cannot have a space in it because it's a name that you're going to use in your code, whereas your display name can have a space in them, and even the description. And description can be lengthy descriptions. Keep your display name as short as possible. And then you have the off type. Now off type is nothing but your data type. So is it going to be number field? Is it going to be currency? Is it going to be single line text, multi-line text? What type of attribute or what type of property are you creating, right? So we define that over here in off type. Now sometimes you have a scenario where you have multiple type that you want to support, like if it's a single line text or a multi-line text. Those are two different data types, but you want that to be supported on one single property. So if that's the case, then you would use something called as off type group. And if you're using off type group, you have to define another tag called type, and type group. And in the type group, you would define a name. So this name, which in this example is called numbers, you would give the same name in the off type group here in the numbers. So what this property does is this property would support all these types, data types that are defined under type group. So it would support whole number, currency, floating point, and decimal. In our example, we are just going to keep it to single line text for today. Okay. So the second attribute is going to be your usage. So usage is going to be either bound or input. What does that mean is if it is a bound, then you are binding that to one of the attribute in CRM. So this description is an attribute in CDS. So our control will be binded to one of the attribute on the form, whereas this label might not be binded to anything on the form because that's not an attribute. So that is what we are defining in the usage. Now, if you're using model-driven app, then you have to have one property with type with usage as bound. With Canvas app, it doesn't actually matter. Now required, as the name suggests, either it can be true or false. So we want it to be true. So we want to be binded at least for one attribute. Now we want another property called as character counter. So character count, sorry, it's going to be character counter limit. So what we want is we want user to define what the limit would be, whether it would be 2000, whether it be 500, whether it be 300. So users are going to define what the limit they want. So that is what my property, second property is going to be. Okay, so again, copy, paste on the name, not being creative here, but you can add whatever display name you want, or even add some description that defines what this property is going to do. Now in here, my data type is not going to be single line text because I'm expecting a number like 200 or 500 or 2000, right? So I'm going to put whole number. So I'm going to put whole dot none. And my usage, as I said, if I'm putting usage as bound, I have to bind it to an attribute, which is not going to be the case here because users would be typing that value when they're configuring the control. So I'm going to use, I'm going to put usage type as input. So bound and input, two things, right? And I'm going to make this as required as well. So that's about it in our configuration, in our control manifest file. We don't want to use any additional resources. We don't want to use any of the feature usages today. So once you have completed modifying your manifest file, you have to go back to your tool and then try to build it. The reason is because initially it had a property called sample data. Now, whenever it has sample data and you have changed any of the property or anything in the property has been changed, it's always a good practice to go back and then build it so that it builds it and then creates a backend file that is called as manifest type. So this manifest type would then get regenerated again. So we are just waiting now. When we hit build, it's showing the status here as running. So we'll just wait for it to get successful. Okay, so now it says succeeded. Now look, let's go back and dive into our index.ts file to start typing the code. Now we are going to use index. We are going to use TypeScript for designing our UI today, but you can use HTML as well. So first thing that we would need is if you look at our control, we need one text box and then one label, right? So let's go and add one text box and one label. So HTML elements. And I'm just going to copy paste the code from my other window. So to save time. So here I have a text box which defines which has a type HTML text area. And I have character count as another variable of type label element. Okay. So now once we have defined that, when we initialize the project, the framework created this file index.ts, and it also gave us 4 functions: init, update view, get outputs, and destroy. Now init is called when the control loads for the first time on the form. So you basically would do your initialization over here. Like if you want to initialize your UI, initialize your server calls, and then do all those initializations of variables. If there are any, then you would do all those initializations in the init function. Update view is invoked whenever the property value changes or the UI changes. So when I talk about property values, so we have defined 2 properties over here, right? Attribute data and character counter limit. So if any of this property changes, that's when the update view would be invoked. Or if say someone expanded or someone maximized the form, or someone just restored the form or changed the height and width, then the update view would be invoked. Okay. Get output is invoked by the framework whenever they are receiving a new data. You could also invoke get outputs by explicitly calling this notify output changed method. Now get outputs is very important when you have to send the data back to your source. So that source could be model driven app form, or it could be a canvas app. So if you're not sending data back, then you're just getting the data, but you're not sending the data back. So if your control is just for viewing purposes, then you don't have to put anything in the get outputs. For example, if it's a barcode, if your control is going to show only the barcode, you don't need to actually send anything back to your source. But for our example today, when you're looking at it, whenever whenever the user enters anything in the text boxes, we want to that data to be sent back to CRM. So in our cases, we would need to use get outputs. Okay, and then destroy is called when the control is getting removed from the DOM. So you can do all kind of cleanup activities in the destroy. Like if you are using React, then unmount the React component, or if you have some API calls that are still invoked and running asynchronously, you can terminate those calls. So things like that, you can do it in destroy. So now we have created these HTML elements. So as I said, we'll use the init method to define our UI. So I'm gonna first do, so now how do I define my UI? So I would, I've declared my variables, HTML element variables over here, but now I will define how they would work. So here, input text box, I have to initialize those variables. Document is nothing but your HTML document dot, and then you have to do what this is an element, right? We have defined here it is an element, so we would do create element. Now what type of element it is? Now we have defined this as a text area, so we would say text area here. These are all the HTML elements that you would get in this function. Now, if I say this is going to be a label instead, then it's going to throw an error saying label is not matching to this text area element, right? Because label is not compatible with text area element. So it does that type check for you. So you have to make sure that whenever you're defining this as text area element, you have to mention text area over here. Okay, so now that's done. Let's go and add initialize our label. Document dot create element, and would say label. Now once we have defined our two variables, one for text area, one for label, we haven't added it to our DOM, right? So it's not added on the DOM. So to add it on the DOM, what the framework does is it gives us a container of type HTML div. So it gives us the div tag, and inside that div tag, we can add this two controls, right? So that is what we are going to do here. So we're going to take this container and then say append, and then append it as a child element. So we're going to say append child, and what we're going to add first is we're going to add input box, and whatever you add first and then second, that defines the order. So if I'm adding input box first, that would be the first thing that gets added, and then it would, and if you append character counter second, then that would be added second. So this defines your order. Append child and then character counter. Okay. So we defined two controls, and then we added those to the div tag. Now we also, as part of the context, and this is the context that I'm talking about, as part of the context, we, as I said, we get the context as part of the framework. We get certain functions. So if I'm going to context, we get client, we get devices, factory, formatting, a lot of other properties you get here. One of the property that we would be looking here today is the parameters property. Now parameters is something, but if you have to access your properties that you have defined in the control manifest file, that would be accessed through parameters. So we would go to parameters, and then you can see that attribute data and character counter are automatically populated as a yeah, those two things are available here. So we would be using attribute data to get the value from the control. So attribute data, and then you would say what we need. So we can get the attribute name. We can get the error. If there is any error, it's a Boolean variable. You can also get the error message. You can get a formatted value, and then you get a raw value. So today I'm going to use my raw value. So I want whatever is been typed in CRM or in the CDS form or in the model driven form. I'm just going to access that value. Okay, and then I'm going to assign that value to my input box. Input box dot value is equal to, it's going to be assigned to a raw. But now sometimes this can be null. On the model driven form, this value can be null. So I want to handle my null cases. So if it is null, then I want to assign empty string to my input box. Okay. Now similarly, I also want to capture what was the data that was entered by the user on the character counter limit property. So I'm gonna take that in a variable. So I'm gonna call it as max character counter. Let's say context dot parameters dot character counter limit dot raw. Now if by any means they have not entered a value, or if they have kept it blank, we have to handle the nulls as well. So if it is null, then my default value is going to be 200. And because this is number, right? Now we have captured what the input was, and we have captured what the maximum character counter that the user has input. Now let's do the calculation for remaining characters. Remaining character, it would be of type number, and what it would be is it would be the max character counter minus input value. So whatever was inputted in the text box, we capture the value and then we get the length. So the maximum characters minus whatever is already added, we are just subtracting it. So this gives us the remaining characters. Okay. Now we would now we have identified how many are my remaining characters. Now if you look at control, what we want is we want to display this text. So we're just going to copy this text and say my label inner HTML is going to be text, right? But I don't want this to be hard coded. I want this to be assigned to something. So I'm going to assign it to, so this is going to be my remaining characters, right? And this is going to be my maximum characters. It is coming from here. So this defines my label, text on the label. Okay, so we have completed our init method. So let's go and save it, and let's go and test how it would look. So before that, we would build it, see if there are no any errors. Okay. and then it succeeded. Now, as I said, the framework provides you with a test harness. So for testing, you can use this test button, and this would invoke the test harness, and the command is npm start watch. And this would start the test harness. And there you go. This is the control. Now, here it's showing 197 characters because there is only 3 characters. Now, if you type anything over here, you can see that the characters are not reducing. The reason for that is we haven't handled any event on the text box, right? So let's go back to our code. And let's add a key up event. So I'm just going to copy the key up event. So here is the key up event. Now on the key up event, we would need what our maximum character value is, because we are capturing the maximum character value in the init function, and we have declared it as a local variable. So instead of declaring it as a local variable, we would need to declare this as a global variable, because we would need to use this in the key up function. So I'm just going to declare this as my global variable. Of type number. And I'll be using this instead of using the local variable, I'll be using the global variable. Over here as well as over here. And over here. Okay. So instead of using local variable, now I'm using global variable so that I can use it on my key up event. Now here the logic still remains the same. I'm taking the maximum characters, and then I'm taking the input box length, subtracting it, and then showing it on my label. Same thing, right? Now, because we are using the start watch, the framework allows us to do the changes, and as soon as you save it, the framework would detect the changes that have happened, rebuild it, and then refresh the component. So this component would refresh again. So let's go and see how that works. So if I go back here, this is unsaved. I'm going to save it and go back here. This would refresh in a minute, and there you go. It refreshed with a value. If I start out, and we forgot one thing to do. We added the key up, but we never actually bind it to the control. So let's go and do that here. Input dot add event listener, and then you would add. So now here what we would do is we would add event. What is the event name? It would be key up. And what are we binding it to? So key up event on key up dot bind. And what are we binding this to? The parent.
Danish, can I add one thing here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, remember this is exactly where for one of our clients, like we had key up, we also had to add this input event as well to make it work in all scenarios.
Yeah, I'm just showing the demo, Sudhakar.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's hold up all the questions till the end, if that's okay. Okay, so I just added a styling here because I just didn't like how it was looking. So I want this to go down here. So I just added some styling to the attribute. Now, as soon as I save it, it is again going to refresh the control, and there you go. So now when I start typing, so now the event is getting triggered, which is calculating the remaining characters now. Okay, so that creates our init. But what's not happening now is we also want to send the data back to the source. So we don't see any data inputs in the test harness, or even this value is not changing. What is expected is whenever the value changes over here, the value should change over here as well. So to make that happen, we have to handle the update view, right? And we also have to capture the notify output changed. Now, notify output changed is only available in the init method. So if you want to use notify output changed in any other methods, what we have to do is we have to capture this notify output changed in a global variable. So we would need to declare notify output changed as a global variable as well. To PCF global variables, and I would just say private notify output changed. So I've declared it as a variable over here. And in the init method, as soon as my init method kicks in, I'm gonna initialize my denotify output change to the notify output change that is part of the init method as the parameter. So I'm assigning my parameter value to my global variable called notify output changed. Now, because we are using notify output changed, as soon as we do that, we can what we want to do is anytime the value changes, so anytime user starts typing up the keys, we want notify output change to be invoked in the key up event, which would ultimately call the get outputs. So notify output changed is what we would be calling here. Now this would ultimately invoke get outputs. And what we want here is, now remember, get outputs only works when you have usage type as bound. So whatever you have declared here as usage type bound would be available for you in the outputs method. So here we have two properties, attribute data and character counter limit. But attribute data has usage type as bound, whereas character counter limit has usage type as input. So in index.ts, if I do control space, I only see attribute data. I don't see the other property mentioned in the get outputs because only bound properties would appear in the get outputs. That means you're saying to the framework that these are bounds. That means these properties may be returned back to its source. Okay, so here is where I would define the value that I have to return back to the source, which would be in my case, the input text value. Okay, so that's it. And then, yeah, we have to also capture the update view. So in the update view, it would be again the same logic. So we have to capture our maximum character. So we have already captured maximum character here, so we don't want to do that. But what we want to do is we want to handle the remaining character and then populate our label accordingly. So we just save it. As soon as we save it, our component will get refreshed because of the framework's ability to trigger itself and refresh itself whenever there is changes occurring. And this is the demo. And as you can see, I'm typing here, the data outputs get generated over here, and it also sends the data back to the data input, and this also gets changed. So, okay. So that's how we create the control. Now, we also want to deploy this control, right? So to deploy the control, there's an issue that I just found out this morning. So I'm going to close it and then reopen this again. So for deploying it, we would create a CDS project, as I mentioned in the deployment steps. I'm going to create a project here. So I'm going to say create, which would create the solution project. And then I would say add this component to this solution. So I'm going to add the component. Once the component is added, I would build it. Yeah. Now, as you can see, it's running. Once it says succeeded over here, I would be able to use this deploy button down here to deploy it to my specific environment. While this is running, I don't want to waste much time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over and I'm going to show my already installed solution, which is this character counter solution. So how do you configure it on the form? So on the form, you would just select your attribute because this is a field type control. You would select an attribute, go to change properties. And there you go. And here you have multiple tabs, right? So at the end, you would see this controls tab. You go to the controls tab and then say add a new control. And in the new control, you would see all these custom controls. Now these custom controls are filtered based on the type that you are defining. So in our code file, when we define the type, we defined it as a single line text, right? So these controls appear only for single line text, which are available for single line text. So our control is actually available for single line text. So we should be actually the control that I created was not for single line text. That was for multi-line text. So see, it is not available over here. Yeah. But if I go to details, I can see that character counter is available over here because this is only available for multiple type control. So this is where the type is very important. So if you're developing for a single line text, then you have to mention single line text, and then you would only see controls for single line text. So let's go and see if our build was succeeded. Now let's go and deploy this. And that was not expected. Let's try again. There you go. Now it's publishing. Are there any questions in the meantime? Anyway, we'll come back to the question. So it got deployed. So let's go and refresh our solution. So we would see the solution name over here. So empower character counter. And then we'll refresh the form. And right now, if I go to the account form summary, I see this is already populated, but it doesn't show the character counter over here. So let's go and add our control on that particular attribute. So empower character counter, as you can see, the type is single line text. You will add it and we'll enable it for web, phone, and tablet. And then as you can see here, character counter limit has been shown. If I click on this particular pencil, here you can either bind to a field, but you can also bind to a static value. If you have mentioned usage type is bound, you would not get this option. So you have to bind it to a field, which is not the case here. So here I'm going to say it's going to be my limit is going to be 200 characters. And this is what makes it so configurable and so powerful using custom controls, which is not the case with HTML web resources. So I added it on the form, I saved it, and now I'm publishing it. Once the publish is completed, let's go and refresh the form. Oh, there's an issue with it. Damn it. All right. I did not use the right namespace. That's why there's a error with the control, but you got the idea, right? It's the same thing that would happen over here. So this would look like this. So let's take questions. Are there any questions?
Yes. Hi, Danish. First, thank for your demo. Do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yeah, I can.
Yes. Thank you so much for your demo. I have three questions. First one, it is the how we can use the execution form context, like what we have today in Dynamics 365, to don't use in the xrm.page. And my second question, if how to use the web API with the custom control.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, you don't actually get the execution context. So execution context is only available when you're working with JavaScripts, but what you get access in as part of the framework is you get the this context. This is not exactly execution context, but it gives you the same ability as execution context. So it doesn't give you um, access to
Attribute.
all the attributes, but
Yes, right.
it does give you access to the attributes that you have defined, but it also gives you access to client, to navigation, to user settings, and then also it gives the access to your second question. What you had asked is to web API. So if
Yes.
doing web API, you can do create records, delete records, retrieve multiple, update records. But if you're using web API, you have to make sure that you're enabling this usage feature in the feature usage section in the manifest file. Otherwise, you would get null exceptions in the web API.
Okay, that means there is no way to use the form context. We need to use the xarm.space to access to the attribute from Dynamics, right?
So if you want to use any of the attributes that are available on the form, what you would do is you would add them as the properties over here. So in case if I have multiple properties that I want to access, like first name, last name, and say phone number are the three properties that I want to access in my control, I would add them as properties over here. So here I would say first name, last name, and then so and so forth. And then I would access this as properties over here in terms of parameters. And when I'm binding it, so when I go to the form, right? So when I go to the form, I will bind it over here. So I will bind. I will go to the controls, go to here, and I will see first name, last name, and phone number, and then I can bind those three attributes over here. So we don't get access to all the attributes from the form, but then we can bind them to some of the attributes of the form, and that is how we get the data.
Okay, okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and as Ivan mentioned, you can actually get xrm.page, right? Even that's what you were referring to, but that's not supported. Any other questions? Yeah, so as Ivan mentioned, think about a custom control as a function, and then your uh, properties are your parameters. So if your function is going to use first name, last name, and phone number, then you're passing them as properties over here because those are your parameters. That's a nice way to put it. Thanks, Ivan. Any other questions? If there are no more questions, we would really like if you can give your suggestions and fill out the survey. So you can scan this QR code from your phone and then fill out the survey. That would help us improve our future sessions. Oh, there is one more question. If you want to get the data from third party using Ajax, will we be facing cross-site scripting errors? You Well, it depends on web API as well. So if you're using, I've deployed my web APIs on Azure, and if you're deploying your web APIs on Azure, you have the setting to enable cross scripting. Cross, you can enable your cross, right? So when you enable your cross, you don't get those issues. It's all about server sides from the web API where you're accessing that. So that's not something that you have to handle it on the client side. And the client side, you just have to handle it through the headers. Documentation for JS API. Can you further explain what do you mean, David? What do you mean by documentation of the JS API? You can unmute yourself if you want to ask the question.
Hey, hello. Yes, that will be faster. I meant sometimes I have been searching for the documentation on all the syntax, all the available objects, the events, how all of they work. I couldn't find a very deep documentation on that. Maybe I misplaced it or something.
Yeah, so you can always go to aka.ms/PCF forums, but you can also access those from the tool itself. So I've given the help section over here, so you can access the Power Apps component frameworks. You can go to Microsoft documentation about custom components. You can also see the PCF limitations here. So if I click over here, it will take you directly to the site that is referring to Power Apps component framework. You can you have the tutorial, so you can go to the tutorial. You have how-to guides in here, and also some sample components as well.
Okay.
And the new link that just came up was with PCF link. So you go to aka.ms/PCF learn, and that takes you to the learn site. Or maybe I didn't type the URL correctly, but I can send the URL for the Learn site. So Microsoft Learn has a new new subject or new topic where you can actually learn how to build PCF controls.
Okay, thank you.
Another question is, what add-in do you find useful in VS Code? Well, I'm not using any particular add-ins for my Visual Studio Code. It's just all basic. Okay. Well, I can hang around for another minute or so if you have any other questions.
Yes, please. It's me again, Danish. Hi.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you how we can make the custom control disable? For example, if you have a record that's it's inactive, and we want to also to make the custom control for read only or disabled.
Yeah, so you that's a very great question. I didn't cover that in this because I thought like it would be little tricky. But yes, you can always read the properties, the attribute values from the context itself. So context.parameters dot attribute data dot, and then you get the even I think so. I need your help here. I forgot how to read the read only or the disable property.
I think it's in the mode. Dot mode.
Yep, right. Dot mode. Dot. Yeah. Is control disable is what you would get here.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
I think yes. And how we can add this to our parameters? For example, if you were to say yeah, this text it will be the disabled. Which property we can use?
I think so. This is the property that you have to use to check if the control is disabled.
Yeah, but this one it's coming from the context. If you want to assign this attribute to your input box, which attribute you can use?
Oh, you want to disable your control
yes,
altogether.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean you can always check what your if this is disabled. If this is true, then what you could do is you could actually do e input box dot set attribute and I think so it's read only. I believe. Oh, maybe it's. I'll have to check. I think so it's read only, something like that. Yeah, read only, and then you say true.
Okay.
That's what you want to use. So you can actually assign it directly to this particular thing instead of doing that. You can directly assign it to context.mode.isControl disabled. So if this is true, then it would read only will be also true.
Okay, thank you so much.
Is there any way to return JSON data to the app? Well, yes, you can do that. You can. You'll have to just write advanced logic to return the data in JSON as well. You would have to write that logic in the return statement in here. So instead of directly assigning this plain text value, you can write a function that would return the JSON and then assign it back to the attribute. Yeah, and as Ivan mentioned, the best practice is to do it in the the disable mode is actually the best practice is to do it in the update view, because you can always activate or deactivate the form. And if the control is already loaded, then init is already invoked. So the best practice is to do it in the update view.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And TXH, yes, to your question, you said that how do you return your JSON data, but there's no output type as JSON. Well, it doesn't have to be. JSON is a text, right? It's a string type data type. So if your attribute type is string, then you can certainly return JSON as a string. You don't need to necessarily have a JSON type. Okay. Any other questions? That does not work with Canvas app. I haven't tried it with Canvas app, but I believe it should be possible, because the Canvas app, whenever you're using it on a control, controls are always expecting text values. They are not expecting JSONs. But then if you get a text value, you can always cast it into a JSON using the functions that are available in the Canvas app. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you guys for attending. And yeah.
Thanks, Danish. Great presentation.
Thanks, Danish.